a cafe less than a mile away, a group of strangers are about to discover the truth, that hundreds of patients have been suffering and dying from neglect.
It was dreadful, it was awful, and it should never have happened.
This is the story of what went wrong and why it was kept hidden for so long.
I think they just didn't care.
The story starts in July 2001 with another NHS scandal and an opportunity missed.
Good evening. Up to 35 babies died unnecessarily at Bristol Royal Infirmary.
Appalling care at Bristol Royal Infirmary has led to the deaths of dozens of babies. Investigators claim the system of monitoring care in our hospitals is completely inadequate. They demand urgent reform and issue this chilling warning.
Could Bristol happen again? Could it be happening right now? The honest answer is that it could. And if it were happening, we would only have a slight chance of knowing.
Sir Ian Kennedy was right. It did happen again. And no one saw it coming. July 2004. It's more than 3 years since the Bristol inquiry. A new hospital watchdog, the Healthcare Commission, has helped restore faith in the health service. But has it really made a difference? One woman is about to find out. Nicola Monti has just given birth to her second child, but returns to Stafford Hospital with a bowel condition. It is a decision she will always regret.
Ward 11 was very busy ward, chaotic, not very clean. Toilets were often filthy. With my condition, I had to provide stool samples which were left in cardboard pots, and those would accumulate in the toilets because the staff weren't taking them away. Not only my own samples but other people, which I think gave rise to cross-infection.
And that is exactly what happened. In the filthy conditions, Nicola picks up not one hospital superbug, but 3. C. difficile, E. coli, and worst of all, MRSA. She spends the next 9 months in hospital, much of it in crippling pain. Sores form all over her body, some more than a foot wide. But staff hardly seem to care.
I found out that I had MRSA by a nurse walking into my isolation room, and she just literally walked inside the door and threw a piece of paper in my direction. I was sitting on the bed, and she said, "Read this, you've got MRSA." It was horrendous. I'd been in hospital a long time by then and I couldn't see my children. I was very isolated, stuck in a room on my own. Although my husband came to see me and spent hours and hours and hours every day with me, it's still incredibly lonely and frightening.
What Nicola didn't know was that the hospital's problems spread far beyond Ward 11. Towards the end of her stay, a member of the local patients group does a routine inspection of A&E.
The area itself was dirty. There was hypodermic needles and dressings on the floor, and patients coming in and going out, and doctors and medical staff touching those patients and then going to another patient and touching them. No gloves with the hands. It doesn't leave much to the imagination that the probability of some form of cross-infection or infection is much higher.
Terry Dayton was so alarmed, he wrote a report. He expected the patients group, the PPI, to call on the hospital to take urgent action. But to his dismay, they did not.
There was a culture of working hand in hand with the hospital and not upsetting the hospital. And there was the fear that because of the nature of the report, that it would cause friction between the hospital and the PPI. And they felt that the report should be, for want of a better word, watered down.
In protest, Terry Dayton left the group and went direct to the hospital's new chief executive. Martin Yates had just inherited a poor management structure, a shortage of nurses, and a multi-million-pound debt. He told Terry Dayton his report had prompted improvements to A&E. But Terry Dayton wasn't satisfied and complained again.
Well, his views was that I'd exaggerated. In fact, I only had about 7 or 8 minutes with him at the outside. It wasn't very long, and I left in disgust.
Someone else was also trying to raise the alarm about A&E. Someone on the inside, a nurse.
And seeing people dying in very, very undignified situations which could have been avoided. They weren't just one-offs now and again, they were relatively frequent. And just on a daily basis, the poor care and the poor standards should never have been allowed.
Helen Donnelly blamed chronic understaffing and poor equipment. She asked managers to take urgent action, but instead, they told her simply to fill out an incident reporting form. During her 6 years in A&E, she would submit nearly 100 forms, but not once was she given any indication they were even read.
Things didn't get listened to or acted upon as perhaps they should have done. And that was one of the main failings, because it went right to the top, that people were just not listening and didn't want to know. And I think that's why things got so extreme at Stafford.
The Department of Health then hands all hospitals 2 daunting new challenges. In Stafford, Chief Executive Martin Yates is just 2 months into the job. But at a meeting, he's told first to balance the hospital's books, and second, win Foundation Trust status. As a Foundation Trust, Stafford will have more control over its affairs, with less interference from government. But again, the condition is a healthy bank balance, and Stafford now owes £10 million.
The instruction was quite clear, money needed to be saved, and the trust had to do that in any way that it could. And ultimately that led to the trust making some dangerous decisions in the years that followed.
The meeting sets in motion 18 months of savage cuts. Chief Executive Martin Yates makes 150 staff redundant.
Next year we have got an issue to deal with, and we're taking those tough decisions now so that we can continue that long-term financial sustainability for what is clearly an excellent hospital service.
But it was far from excellent. And those tough decisions had an unintended impact on patient care. Staff became obsessed with cost-cutting, something Nicola Monti noticed when she was given a new drug.
When they were setting this drug up, the nurses were like, "You do realise how much this little bag costs? It's like £700–800 for just this one little bag for you." As if, like, you're not really worth it.
In casualty too, they were feeling the pinch.
Lack of staff, lack of equipment. The reason was always given, oh, well, we're striving for foundation status, but once we're in control of our own finances, that will get better. Which I think is another reason why a lot of people didn't speak out or weren't quite so concerned, because we thought, well, given time, things will improve.
The pressure was coming right from the top. The government was telling all hospitals not only to break even, but also to go for Foundation Trust status. But Labour politicians deny they're partly to blame for what happened at Stafford.
In a sense, you know, that suggests that actually the Chief Executive was right to cut staff and put receptionists on triage nursing because he was under so much pressure. I don't accept that at all. That was a absolute poor, disgracefully poor management of that hospital.
A year on, and Stafford's dark secret remains hidden. George DL goes into hospital for an operation. His wife, Christine, goes with him. What they don't know is that the hospital now has one of the highest death rates in England.
Nobody was warned. It wasn't heavily publicised or anything at that time, you know, what had actually gone on at Stafford Hospital. If I had been aware, he wouldn't have gone in there. He wouldn't.
George's operation is a success, but the couple's joy is short-lived. His epidural becomes dislodged, leaving him without pain relief for days. He's given the wrong food, making him throw up feces. He's left in soiled bedclothes for hours, and he's too scared to ask his nurse for water.
He was frightened to drink. He was frightened that he would actually miss the bed again, because she was so nasty with him when he had to call her. They were just completely left on their own all the time. And if they rang the bells, it was very rare if the nurses or anybody came to see them. George was a proud man. He was always very clean in himself, and to be put in a position that he was put in, he felt ashamed, he felt disgusted. He was so upset, you know, with what was happening to him.
When Christine visits her husband, she's so horrified by his condition that she demands to see a doctor.
I helped to get his jacket off so she could examine him. Sorry. When I did, his bones were just sticking out like that in his back. And I said to him, I said, what on earth are you doing to him? I said, he shouldn't be like this.
During his 2 weeks in hospital, George DL had lost 3.5 stone. His strength had gone.
The one thing that I was really pleased about that night was when we were leaving, I was hugging him and I said, I love you. And he says, I love you too. And that was the last words we said.
That night, George DL's name was added to the growing list of people who went into Stafford Hospital, but never came out. But what Christine DL didn't know was that the list was being monitored by a group of statisticians 140 miles away in London.
The reason why we started doing it was because after the Bristol inquiry, I realised that there were problems that could be detected by analysing the data, and I wanted to make sure that Bristol didn't occur again, so that we could send a letter to Bristols around the country and say, this is an early warning, please look into it.
And in 2007, one hospital began cropping up again and again: Stafford.
We were getting these indications from the data that they were particularly high in a number of procedures and diagnoses. And each month, I and my colleague, Paul Aylin, sent a letter to the Chief Exec, Martin Yates, and we said, we've noticed that you've got a high death rate, double the national death rate for this particular diagnosis or procedure. It's possible that it could be coding, or it might possibly also be due to quality of care. Would you like to have a look to see if there's any problem?
But managers and their NHS bosses were wary. They already suspected there were serious flaws in the way the hospital collected the data. So they commissioned a team of academics to investigate whether there could be another explanation.
Their reaction was to employ somebody else effectively to try to discredit us. And that was very frustrating. And it was frustrating they wouldn't allow us to go up there and explain to them what the problem was. And all over that period, those months, people were dying.
and they were dying in their hundreds. Then in September came a day when the people of Stafford began to fight back. 86-year-old Bella Bailey is admitted to hospital with a hernia. With her is an expert, someone who would ultimately bring Stafford's problems to the nation's attention. Bella's daughter is a senior social worker.
Mum's care was absolutely appalling. There was no medication, there was no proper food for her. She was lying in a wet bed. If it hadn't have been for us there with her, she would have we would have lost her in the first week.
Julie Bailey was so concerned, she insisted on staying at her mother's bedside during the night. It was then that she saw just how desperate some patients had become.
I was told that they couldn't leave drinks out at night because of their health and safety. So what the confused patients would do would just get out of bed, and the first thing they found would be a flower vase and just drink out of the flower vase. It was just absolutely ridiculous.
On November the 8th, 2007, Bella Bailey died, and her daughter's campaign began. She made an official complaint, but found the response from the Director of Nursing alarming.
She said that she'd never seen anything like I'd seen on the wards, and she walked the wards day and night. That really shocked me, and I knew, I was just so desperate, and I knew if I'd seen those things, other people must have. If I'd lost Mum in that way, other people must have lost in the same way. So I knew alone I was going to achieve little with that sort of response from the hospital.
So Julie Bailey appealed for help. In a letter to a local newspaper, she asked anyone with concerns about the hospital to get in touch and set up a meeting. The response was overwhelming.
My priority was to try and stop what was going on in the hospital now. So when people started to arrive, it was quite a shock because I only had 16 seats and there was around 25 people turned up.
As they compare stories, the sheer scale of the scandal becomes clear. Stafford's dark secret is out. A campaign group is born. They called themselves Cure the NHS. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, staff are also beginning to speak out, exposing even more scandals. Nurse Helene Donnelly writes a report telling senior managers that in A&E, patient records have been routinely doctored in order to meet government targets. Waiting times changed, so they appear to fall below the 4-hour limit.
The main culprits would routinely do this, but moreover they would actually encourage other staff to do it, doctors and nurses. And if they didn't want to, such as myself, they would become very aggressive and bullying, basically, into making people do it.
The hospital investigates and hands 2 nurses improvement notices, but concludes there's not enough evidence to take it further. Helene Donnelly resigns.
February 2008, and the campaign to expose poor care at Stafford is gathering pace. In London, health service regulators are about to launch a full investigation, triggered by the alarmingly high death rates. In Stafford, Julie Bailey is protesting outside the hospital, but inside, staff are putting up balloons. The reason? Stafford has just been awarded Foundation Trust status. In the eyes of the NHS, it is now a flagship hospital.
If you can imagine, we were standing outside with our banners at the time, and one of the managers from the hospital came out and told us we'd just been awarded Foundation Trust status. And I said, what does that mean? It's a flagship hospital. There's nothing wrong here, they said. It was like a slap in the face.
Stafford Hospital faced an imminent investigation, had one of the highest death rates in England, and a public campaign against it. And yet, it was allowed to join the Premier League of hospitals, giving it greater freedom to do as it pleased.
One evening, just a month later, a group of experts from the Healthcare Commission conduct a surprise inspection of A&E. It is the start of an investigation that will ultimately expose one of the biggest scandals in the history of the health service.
Virtually everywhere that we looked, there were problems. Whether, as I say, it was in the accident and emergency department, on the medical wards, or on the emergency surgical wards, you know, problems were there. Simple compassion and kindness, those were missing, but also the more technical side of things, you know, whether observations were done properly and recorded properly, whether equipment was used properly. I mean, can you imagine a situation in which, because nurses don't understand cardiac monitors and are annoyed by their bleeping, they turn the monitors off?
Investigators find that hundreds of patients have died from incompetence and neglect. But when they confront Chief Executive Martin Yates, they are stunned by his response.
He was actually shocked at what we were telling him. And that in itself is sort of difficult, because really, you know, you should know what's going on in your own hospital.
The man in charge may not have known the scale of the problem, but by March 2009, everyone did.
Routinely neglected, a damning inquiry concludes Stafford Hospital lost sight of its responsibility to provide
For
safe
years, 25 NHS watchdogs had missed what was going on at Stafford. But finally, after hundreds of deaths, thousands of complaints, and a catalogue of damning reports, the man at the top was told.
We were appalled by Stafford. I publicly apologised. I apologised on behalf of the government. I apologised on behalf of the Department of Health for what happened at Stafford. It was dreadful. It was awful. And it should never have happened. Should I have done something to pick up earlier? Maybe. I don't know.
Back in Stafford, the hospital's chief executive, Martin Yates, was suspended. He acknowledged the hospital's failings and apologised. 5 years after Nicola Monti's first complaints, something had finally changed.
I struggled to find any satisfaction in knowing we were right all along. I was made to feel that I was the exception, that this sort of thing was, you know, I was the unfortunate one person that this had happened to. And it was how I responded to the situation. But it wasn't, you know, lots of people were suffering and, you know, still continue to suffer today.
This is a story of appalling and unnecessary suffering of hundreds of people.
The findings of an inquiry into why the scandal was allowed to happen have now been made public. Robert Francis described a catalogue of failures at every level of the NHS.
I have today made 290 recommendations designed to change this culture and make sure that patients come first.
Everything we've heard today tells us this was systemic failings from the ward right to the top, right to Whitehall.
Just as they did after the Bristol inquiry, politicians have promised to learn from the mistakes of the past.
So we will create a single failure regime where the suspension of the board can be triggered by failures in care as well as failures in finance. And we'll put the voice of patients and staff at the heart of the way hospitals go about their work.
For those who fought for change for so long, it is a defining moment.
Very emotional. I think we'll all be glad when it's over and just hope now that people of Stafford will understand what we've tried to do. Not for ourselves now, just for them.
In Stafford, the hospital's future is uncertain. Riddled with debt, it survives only on government handouts. But there's a new chief executive with a new strategy. Now, when a department is short of staff, it simply closes its doors.
There comes a point where you have to make quite difficult decisions around safety, and in the case of the accident and emergency department, that's what we did. There's no point trying to run a ward safely if you haven't got the right numbers of nurses and doctors. I think the care is very much better than it was 2-3 years ago, very much better. We're not perfect, we don't get it right every time, but I think that the standards have dramatically improved.
Perhaps finally, Stafford has a hospital it can trust. But those who suffered there have heard it all before.
They've wasted so much time and it's caused so much harm to so many people. If they'd have listened to me years ago, it could have prevented it. Nothing would have changed my situation, but it could have prevented other people's suffering and loss of life.